Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So we're diving into something today that is just, well, it's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It really is.
Because I want you to imagine, like, being an editor, but not just any editor. Imagine taking a red pen to a manuscript written by William Shakespeare.
Oh, man, the pressure of that.
Right, but this guy didn't feel pressure. In 1725, this highly respected literary mind actually expressed a sincere desire to just permanently delete entire scenes from the historical record.
Just wipe them out entirely.
Exactly. And not because they were politically treasonous or, contained dangerous state secrets. He wanted to censor them because he literally thought the jokes were too embarrassing.
Too lowbrow.
Yeah, too lowbrow for the refined public. He actually believed that the greatest playwright in the English language had just stooped to writing absolute garbage for the unwashed masses.
And he felt he had to protect Shakespeare from himself.
He really did.
I mean, it's a terrifying level of editorial arrogance when you frame it that way.
Yeah.
The idea that a single critic could just look at a foundational text of English literature and decide, on a whim really, that certain parts were just too low to survive.
Which is wild because we take the complete works for granted today.
Right. We assume they were just handed down to us on stone tablets.
It's like they were always pristine and perfect.
Exactly. But the reality is these texts survived a gauntlet of, these hypercritical gatekeepers who fundamentally misunderstood the genius they were evaluating.
So today we're going to look at exactly how and why that happens. And more importantly, how one brilliant critic fought back against that elitism.
It's a great story.
Our mission on this deep dive is to explore how we evaluate the raw early works of a genius. We're looking through the lens of this incredibly dense, fascinating piece of commentary by the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt.
Hazlitt is just phenomenal here.
He wrote this critique about one of Shakespeare's earliest, messiest, and honestly most debated plays, The Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Yeah, and Hazlitt's essay is remarkable because it's basically a masterclass in how to read.
How so?
Well, he doesn't just evaluate the play itself, he evaluates the people evaluating the play.
Love that.
Right. He dissects the psychology of the snobbish editor. He vigorously defends the mechanics of lowbrow humor, and then he pivots. He highlights some of the most soaring, psychologically profound poetry Shakespeare ever wrote. Which
perfectly hits our core wisdom for today, because Hazlitt is asking us a really fundamental question. When we look at a piece of art, or, just a rough draft from a colleague, do we value sterile, rigid perfection?
Which is what a lot of people want.
Yeah, but do we want that, or do we value something that's maybe flawed, a bit careless, but is undeniably pulsing with genuine human spirit?
I think we have to start with how Hazlitt views this specific play, because he makes a pretty major concession right out of the gate.
He definitely does. He doesn't pretend it's Hamlet.
No, not at all. He doesn't pretend it's Macbeth either. He actually calls it, quote, little more than the first outlines of a comedy loosely sketched in.
Right.
And he claims it's a story dramatized with very little labor or pretension.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I actually find that visual metaphor of the first outlines super compelling.
It's a great image.
I mean, when you look at an artist's sketchbook, the lines are overlapping, right? The proportions might be slightly off. The shading is kind of hurried.
It's a working document.
Exactly. It's a working document, not a museum piece.
And that sketchbook metaphor is really crucial for understanding Hazlitt's entire thesis. Because in the visual arts, especially back in the Renaissance, artists used this technique called underdrawing.
Underdrawing, right.
Yeah, they would sketch the rough composition on the canvas before they ever applied the heavy layers of oil paint. So Hazlitt is suggesting that Shakespeare, early in his career here, was essentially doing theatrical underdrawing.
He wasn't agonizing over every single syllable yet.
Exactly. He wasn't crafting those impenetrable, multi-layered philosophical soliloquies we see in the later tragedies. He was moving quickly. He was testing his tools.
Iterating rapidly, basically.
Yeah, rapid iteration.
But I guess the pushback there is, doesn't that inherently make it a lesser work?
Well, that's the question.
Because if an artist isn't putting in the labor, why should we, the audience, put in the time to appreciate it? We usually associate greatness with, intense, agonizing effort. The tortured artist bleeding onto the page.
Right, but that's exactly the assumption Hazlitt is trying to dismantle. Because heavy labor in art, it can sometimes be a mask.
Yo, that's interesting.
It can feel manipulative. You can almost feel the artist sweating, aggressively trying to force you to laugh or to cry.
They're trying too hard.
Exactly. And Hazlitt argues that because Shakespeare's not over-laboring here, because there's this absence of pretension, his natural instincts just take over.
Right, his baseline talent.
Yeah, Hazlitt insists that despite the play being a mere outline, it possesses what he calls a careless grace and felicity.
Careless grace. I want to dwell on that phrase for a second because it perfectly captures this specific phenomenon in music.
Okay, yeah.
Think about when an acoustic demo of a really famous song leaks to the public.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean.
The artist is just sitting in their living room, playing an out-of-tune guitar, maybe mumbling half the lyrics because they haven't even finished writing the second verse yet.
It's messy.
It is, by definition, careless. But occasionally you hear that raw demo, and it just hits you so much harder than the final polished album version.
Because that final version goes through a gauntlet of producers. They add compression, they stack 20 vocal tracks, they perfectly auto-tune every single pitch.
They add the labor and pretension Hazlitt is talking about.
They really do.
Actually, wait, no, it's worse than that. It's not just adding layers, it's suffocating the original impulse.
That's a good point.
The studio polish strips away the vulnerability. The magic of that demo was its lack of anxiety.
Yeah.
The artist wasn't trying to make a hit record. They were just expressing a feeling.
And that careless grace allows you to hear the unmediated soul of the creator.
Exactly.
You know, the word Hazlitt pairs with grace is felicity. And in this 19th century critical context, that implies a sort of happy, effortless appropriateness.
Effortless appropriateness.
Yeah, like when a genius is completely unburdened by the anxiety of producing a quote-unquote masterpiece, their baseline instincts are often just vastly superior to the most painstakingly crafted output of an average talent.
So Hazlitt is telling us that Shakespeare's ruck sketches contain more vital energy than the polished works of lesser playwrights.
Exactly.
But if the play has this undeniable raw energy, you'd assume the editors entrusted with preserving Shakespeare's legacy would recognize it.
You would hope so.
You'd think they would treat this play like that precious acoustic demo and really protect its rough edges. But that brings us back to that historical editor I mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Alexander Pope.
Yes, Alexander Pope. Hazlitt uses him as the ultimate cautionary tale of the fastidious critic.
And we really need some historical context on Pope here.
Go for it.
So Alexander Pope was an absolute titan of 18th century literature. He was a neoclassical poet, which means he valued order, symmetry, and reason above almost everything else.
Everything had to be neat and tidy.
Extremely tidy. The neoclassical mindset looked back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, believing art should follow strict rules and maintain a dignified decorum.
Okay, so when Pope took on the task of editing Shakespeare,
he was approaching a wild, sprawling Renaissance playwright with the mindset of an Enlightenment-era perfectionist.
Which is a total recipe for critical friction.
A massive collision of worldviews.
And Hazlitt exposes this friction by pointing out this incredible contradiction in Pope's own marginal notes on the play. Hazlitt essentially catches Pope suffering from critical whiplash from one scene to the next.
It's pretty funny to read, honestly.
Let's look at the first note. Pope is reading a scene, and he writes, quote, "It is observable, I know not for what cause, that the style of this comedy is less figurative and more natural and unaffected than the greater part of this author's, though it's supposed to be one of the first he wrote."
Pope is actually offering praise there, though it's kind of bewildered praise.
He sounds confused by it.
Right, because he prefers clarity. When he says the style is less figurative, he means Shakespeare isn't drowning the dialogue in dense, confusing metaphors.
He feels a sense of relief.
Exactly. He thinks he's found a moment where the young Shakespeare is behaving properly, writing natural and unaffected dialogue that conforms to 18th century polite standards.
But here's where it gets really interesting. His relief doesn't even last a full page.
No, it all falls apart immediately.
Hazlitt points out that literally in the very next scene, Pope completely loses his mind. He encounters a scene driven by comedic wordplay and drops this furious note in the margins.
He was so mad.
He writes, "This whole scene, like many others in these plays, is composed of the lowest and most trifling conceits, to be accounted for only by the gross taste of the age he lived in."
And then he uses a Latin phrase.
Right. He follows it up with populo placerant, meaning to please the people. And then he delivers the ultimate editorial threat.
His famous threat.
He says, "I wish I had authority to leave them out, but I have done all I could, set a mark of reprobation upon them. throughout this edition.
A mark of reprobation. That is essentially Pope putting a giant judgmental asterisk next to the text, basically warning the reader, I, your educated editor, apologize for this garbage.
It's a stunning pivot. One moment the writing is natural and unaffected, and the next, it's the absolute lowest form of trifling conceits.
The whiplash is real.
I really have to push back on Pope's entire worldview here. I mean, how can a supposedly brilliant critic praise a work's naturalness and then threaten to censor the very next scene simply because the humor is broadly appealing?
It's a great question.
He uses the phrase gross taste of the age and that Latin phrase as profound insults. He's literally saying, this joke is for the unwashed masses, therefore it has zero artistic merit. It's just such a fragile, elitist way to view art.
Well, this raises an important question about the psychology of criticism itself. To understand Pope's terror, we have to look at the mindset of the fastidious critic.
What are they so afraid of?
Critics like Pope desire absolute control over the aesthetic environment. They want literature to be like a formal, polite dinner party.
Where everyone uses the correct silverware.
Exactly, and everyone speaks in measured, quiet tones. So when Shakespeare introduces a pun or a body joke or a trifling conceit delivered by a servant character,
it ruins the dinner party.
Right. It's the equivalent of someone crashing that polite gathering, tracking mud onto the carpet, and laughing way too loudly.
Pope cannot handle the intrusion of the lowbrow into his highbrow space.
Not at all. His instinct isn't to try to understand the mechanics of the joke. His instinct is immediate censorship.
He wants to sanitize the acoustic demo. He wants to digitally remove the sound of the singer taking a breath or the squeak of the guitar strings, because those things aren't proper music.
Which is exactly what we do today when we over-edit ourselves or our peers, right? We hunt for the mark of reprobation.
That is such a good modern translation of this issue. We get obsessed with making things look professional, and we strip the soul right out of it.
But Hazlitt completely rejects this snobbery. He doesn't just roll his eyes at Pope. He actively goes to war to defend the exact low scenes that Pope marked with reprobation.
I love how Hazlitt executes this. It's a brilliant critical maneuver. He actually accepts Pope's premise, but flips the conclusion.
Yeah, he takes the weapon right out of Pope's hand.
He admits that these familiar comedic scenes are made up of conceits. And a conceit, in this literary context, is a fanciful, clever, sometimes far-fetched comparison, right?
Or an extended piece of wordplay, yeah.
So Hazlitt says, yes, these conceits might be considered low subject matter, but then they are not poor, but rich ones.
Not poor, but rich ones. That single distinction completely destroys Pope's argument.
It really does. Hazlitt is arguing that the subject matter of a scene, like whether it's about kings discussing war or servants discussing a dog, that doesn't dictate its artistic value.
Right.
A joke can be about something completely mundane, totally low class, but the architectural construction of that joke, the psychological insight required to make it land,
can be incredibly rich.
Exactly.
And Hazlitt provides a really concrete example of this by pointing to this famous scene in the fourth act. It features the servant character Launce and his dog Crab.
Yes. The dog scene.
Hazlitt calls it a perfect treat in the way of farcical drollery and invention. And for those unfamiliar with the play, Launce does what is essentially an early version of a stand-up comedy routine.
It totally is stand-up.
He's complaining that when he left his family to go on a journey, everyone was weeping hysterically. But his dog, Crab, didn't shed a single tear.
The audacity of the dog.
Right, so Launce uses his shoes, his staff, and his hat as props to represent his weeping mother, father, and sister. He's physically acting out this chaotic domestic melodrama on stage.
All while the actual dog just sits there.
Completely blank and indifferent.
It's pure, undeniable physical comedy. And I can see why an 18th century snob like Pope would hate it. I mean, there's no grand philosophical meaning. It's a guy complaining about his ungrateful pet.
But look at the invention required to execute it. The comedy comes from this profound human tendency to project complex emotional expectations onto animals.
Oh, we still do that all the time.
Right. Launce expects human empathy from a terrier. The richness of the conceit lies in the absurdity of that emotional asymmetry.
Yes.
It requires immense theatrical skill to write a scene that relies on the comedic timing of an unresponsive animal. So Pope sees a servant talking about a dog and dismisses it as low.
While Hazlitt sees a flawless piece of comedic engineering.
Exactly, one that taps into a universal human absurdity.
And Hazlitt doesn't stop there. He moves on to defend another servant character, Speed. And this scene really demands a serious, extensive breakdown because it is so dense.
It is. Hazlitt explicitly defends Speed's method of proving that his master, Valentine, has fallen in love.
Hazlitt writes that this scene is not deficient in wit or sense, though the style may be criticized as not simple enough for the modern taste.
And when Hazlitt warns that the style isn't simple enough, he's basically signaling to the reader that we are about to encounter a very dense, rapid-fire catalog of Elizabethan psychological observation.
It is a barrage of metaphors. It really requires close attention.
So let's look at it.
Let's read the text and see exactly what Hazlitt considers to be rich wit. The setup is simple. Valentine, a nobleman, asks his servant, Speed, "Why, how know you that I am in love?"
And Speed is very confident.
Extremely confident. Speed replies that he knows it by these special marks, and then he proceeds to just absolutely roast his master with a devastating checklist of symptoms.
It's brutal.
The first mark Speed lists is that Valentine has learned to wreathe your arms like a malcontent.
Okay, so we have to unpack the cultural weight of the malcontent here.
Please do, because that goes over a modern listener's head.
Right. So in Elizabethan psychology, which was governed by the theory of the four humors, the malcontent was a very specific, recognizable archetype.
Like a goth kid today.
Kind of. It was someone suffering from an excess of black bile, and this led to deep melancholy, cynicism, and just total alienation from society.
So by reading his arms, crossing them tightly over his chest, Valentine is physically barricading himself from the world.
Exactly. Speed is acutely observing that love hasn't made his master joyful. It has made him defensive, moody, and deeply unhappy with his surroundings.
But then the next symptom on Speed's list creates this massive, hilarious contrast. He says Valentine has also learned to relish a love song like a robin redbreast.
The shift in imagery there is what makes the conceit so rich.
Just jarring.
In one breath, Valentine is this brooding, cynical philosopher hating the world. In the very next breath, he's a tiny bird piping sweet, repetitive little melodies.
Because the robin was known for its constant, cheerful song.
Right, so Speed is diagnosing the erratic, swinging pendulum of romantic obsession. You're moping in the corner one minute and humming a love song the next.
Which is so accurate.
It really is.
But then the third symptom takes a very dark turn. Speed notes that Valentine has learned to walk alone like one that had the pestilence.
The pestilence, meaning the bubonic plague.
It's a staggering comparison when you really think about it.
It is, because in Shakespeare's time, the plague was a terrifying, omnipresent reality.
It wasn't a joke.
No. If you had the pestilence, you were forcibly quarantined. You walked alone because society shunned you to avoid infection.
So Speed is saying that Valentine has voluntarily inflicted this quarantine upon himself.
Exactly. The sickness of his infatuation has caused him to isolate himself from his friends. He's wandering alone because he's consumed by his internal condition.
Man, Speed is just relentless. And he follows that up with a psychological trope that is just brutal. He says he learned to sigh like a schoolboy that had lost his ABC.
We really need to consider the specific anxiety of that image.
Yeah. What does that mean in context?
So a young Elizabethan schoolboy who lost his primer, his hornbook containing the alphabet, he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to receive a severe physical beating from his schoolmaster.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the sigh of that boy is a very specific type of desperate, fearful, impotent anxiety.
And Speed applies that to Valentine.
Yes. Valentine is an adult. He's a gentleman. A nobleman, but Speed is comparing his master's grand romantic angst to the petty, terrified whimpering of a child about to be spanked.
It completely strips Valentine of his dignity. He totally infantilizes him.
It does.
And he doubles down on it with the next line. Speed says Valentine has learned to weep like a young wench that had lost her grandam.
So once again, Speed is demoting his master's grief.
Demoting it, yeah.
Valentine isn't weeping like a tragic hero facing the wrath of the gods. He's crying like a young girl who lost her grandmother.
Which is genuine grief, obviously.
Certainly. But it's a dependent, domestic, highly sentimental type of weeping. It subverts all the expectations of noble, masculine stoicism.
Okay, so that's the psychological toll. But then Speed moves to the physical toll this crush is taking. He says Valentine has learned to fast like one that takes diet, to watch like one that fears robbing, to speak polling like a beggar at Hallowmas.
The physical symptoms are clinically precise here.
What does fasting like one that takes diet mean?
That refers to a strict medical regimen. Valentine isn't just skipping a meal. He looks like someone who has been ordered by a physician to starve themselves to purge a disease.
And watching like one that fears robbing.
That uses watching in the sense of forced wakefulness.
Insomnia.
Insomnia. This is lying in bed, wide-eyed in the pitch dark, heart racing, terrified that a thief is breaking into the house. It's the physical manifestation of severe anxiety.
And speaking, cooling like a beggar at Halamas. Cooling means what? Whining.
Whining, whimpering, speaking in a weak, pathetic register. And Halamas is the beginning of November, so the start of the bitter winter cold.
Right.
A beggar at Halamas is at their absolute most desperate, shivering, and pleading for survival. So Speed is pointing out that Valentine's voice has lost all its authority and resonance. He sounds like a freezing, desperate vagrant.
The absolute destruction of this man's ego is incredible.
It's thorough.
But what makes this a masterpiece of comedic writing isn't just the list of symptoms. It's how Speed sets up the punchline.
The before and after.
Yes. He contrasts all this pathetic, whimpering behavior with Valentine's quote-unquote before state, how the guy used to act before he met this girl.
Right.
Speed reminds him, you were wont, when you laughed, to crow like a cock. When you walked, to walk like one of the lions. When you fasted, it was presently after dinner. When you looked sadly, it was for want of money.
The architectural structure of this joke is just mathematically flawless.
It is.
He establishes the before image as incredibly aggressive, loud, and robust, laughing with the piercing volume of a rooster, strutting around like an apex predator, a lion, puffing his chest out.
The line about fasting is arguably the smartest joke in the play. When you fasted, it was presently after dinner.
It's brilliant. The only time Valentine ever stopped eating was when he was already completely physically stuffed from a massive feast.
He was a creature of massive appetites.
Exactly.
And his emotional state was entirely practical. When you look sadly, it was for want of money. He didn't care about the pestilence of love or singing like a robin. He was a practical, loud, greedy guy whose only concern was his bank account.
Which brings Speed to the final, devastating conclusion of the diagnosis. He says, and now you are metamorphosed with a mistress, that when I look on you, I can hardly think you my master.
So, bringing this into modern translation for a second, I read this exchange, and I realized that the core human experience has not shifted a single inch in 400 years.
Not one bit.
This is exactly the same dynamic as a modern friend roasting you at a bar because you completely changed your personality overnight for a new partner.
We've all seen it happen.
Your friend looks at you and says, look, a month ago you were wearing sweatpants, drinking cheap beer, and the only thing you cared about was your fantasy football team. Today you're wearing a turtleneck, drinking oat milk matches, and quoting obscure French poetry. Who are you and what have you done with my friend?
That is exactly it. The context changes, but the psychological metamorphosis of infatuation remains entirely recognizable.
And this is why Hazlitt fiercely defends the wit and sense of this scene against Pope's censorship.
Pope looks at this text and sees a servant talking out of turn, using low similes about beggars, roosters, and lost alphabet books. Pope sees it as trifling.
Right.
But Hazlitt looks at the exact same text and sees a profound, highly structured catalog of human behavior masquerading as farce.
Brilliant.
The conceit, this servant diagnosing the master through a checklist of absurd yet clinically accurate metaphors, it requires a massive intellect to construct. Shakespeare is laying bare the ridiculousness of the human condition.
Showing us that when we fall in love, we lose our dignity, our habits, and our very identities.
Exactly.
It is incredibly satisfying to see Hazlitt validate the intellectual rigor behind a great joke. He proves that comedy can be a vehicle for profound truth.
It absolutely can.
But if The Two Gentlemen of Verona was entirely made up of servants doing stand-up comedy and roasting their masters, it might still just be considered a brilliant farce.
Right, just a funny play.
What elevates Hazlitt's commentary and what makes this play a true sketch of a masterpiece is how Shakespeare completely shifts gears. Hazlitt pivots from defending the low comedy to examining the soaring, exquisite poetry on the other end of the emotional spectrum.
Hazlitt understands that to prove the genius of the play, he has to demonstrate its emotional bandwidth.
He needs to show that the high poetical spirit he mentioned in his opening thesis is just as powerful as the comedic invention.
Yeah, he has to move from the cynical external observations of Speed to the deeply internal, vulnerable emotional life of the heroine, Julia.
And Hazlitt points to the play's sweetness of sentiment. He maps out Julia's arc, noting how she starts with playful coquetry with her maid, Lucetta, over receiving a letter from her lover, Proteus.
But that playfulness is shattered later.
Right, when she discovers Proteus has been completely faithless to his vows. Hazlitt actually compares Julia to Imogen, the heroine of Shakespeare's later play Cymbeline, praising Julia's tender constancy.
And by invoking Imogen, who is widely considered one of Shakespeare's most perfectly realized, deeply devoted, and tragic female characters, Hazlitt is sending a really strong signal to his readers.
What's the signal?
He's saying, we are no longer dealing with farcical drollery. We are entering the realm of profound, agonizing emotional stakes.
And to prove this, Hazlitt selects one specific passage to analyze, which he calls a beautiful piece of poetry. The context of the scene is critical here.
Very critical.
Julia's decided she wants to disguise herself as a boy and travel a long, highly dangerous distance to reunite with Proteus. Her maid, Lucetta, is terrified for her and tries to talk her out of this reckless plan.
The rhetorical battle they engage in is just astounding. We really need to look closely at the mechanics of this argument.
It operates as a masterclass in using metaphor as a weapon of persuasion.
So Lucetta speaks first, and she's attempting to be the voice of mature societal reason.
The voice of caution.
Right. She tells Julia, I do not seek to quench your love's hot fire, but qualify the fire's extremist rage, lest it should burn above the bounds of reason.
Let's look at the element Lucetta chooses. Fire.
Yeah.
In this context, fire represents a dangerous, consuming, almost violent force. It has extremist rage. It destroys what it touches. Lucetta is essentially saying, I'm not telling you to stop loving him. I'm not trying to completely quench the fire, but you have to qualify it. You have to control this blaze before it burns your life to the ground and pushes you beyond the bounds of sanity.
Lucetta's argument is rooted in the classical virtue of moderation.
Right.
Passion, represented by fire, must be contained by the intellect and by societal boundaries. If it escapes the fireplace, it burns the house down. It's a very logical, persuasive warning.
It makes total sense. But Julia's response is what makes this poetry legendary. She doesn't argue with Lucetta's logic regarding fire. Instead, she performs a breathtaking piece of rhetorical judo and completely rejects the premise.
She changes the elemental physics of the argument.
She replies, the more thou damn'st it up, the more it burns.
The linguistic pivot there is phenomenal. Damn'st it up. You cannot dam a fire.
No, you can't.
You can only dam a body of water. So in half a line of poetry, Julia shifts the metaphor from a destructive, raging fire to a powerful, flowing river. Yet she retains the verb burns to maintain the emotional continuity of her passion.
That is just brilliant. I want to read Julia's full monologue, because the imagery she uses to describe this river of emotion is some of the most beautiful writing we've encountered on this show.
It really is.
Julia says, the current that with gentle murmur glides, thou knowest, being stopped impatiently doth rage. But when his fair course is not hindered, he makes sweet music with the enameled stones, giving a gentle kiss to every sedge he overtaketh in his pilgrimage. And so by many winding nooks he strays, with willing sport to the wild ocean.
So let's analyze the physics and the psychology mapped out in those lines.
Where do we start?
Julia begins with the concept of the hindered stream, a current that normally glides with a gentle murmur. What happens when you try to apply Lucetta's advice?
When you try to stop the water.
Right. What happens when you dam it up and control it? It impatiently doth rage.
Because you can't actually destroy the water, you only restrict its flow, which builds immense, dangerous pressure.
Exactly. By trying to control it, you turn a peaceful stream into a violently destructive flood.
I mean, consider the alternative she presents. The attempt to repress the emotion is the actual source of the danger, not the emotion itself.
That's a huge psychological insight.
Julia argues that when the stream's fair course is not hindered, it behaves entirely differently. When passion is allowed its natural expression, it doesn't destroy the landscape.
He makes sweet music with the enameled stones.
Yes. It interacts with the obstacles in its path beautifully. The stones in the riverbed aren't pulverized by a raging flood. They are enameled,
Polished,
and made to shine vibrantly by the water rushing over them. The interaction creates music.
And look at the physical intimacy of the next line, giving a gentle kiss to every sedge.
What's a sedge exactly?
A sedge is a fragile, grass-like plant that grows along the riverbank. So a raging flood would tear the sedge out by its roots. But the unhindered stream merely kisses the plants as it passes by on its pilgrimage.
And the word choice of pilgrimage is vital there, isn't it?
It is. It elevates her romantic journey from a foolish, impulsive errand into a sacred, spiritual duty.
We follow this pilgrimage to its ultimate destination. And so by many winding nooks he strays, with willing sport, to the wild ocean.
The wild ocean, the infinite expanse.
It represents the ultimate surrender of the individual self into a force that is ancient and boundless.
The way Julia dismantles Lucetta's fear is just awe-inspiring. Lucetta says, "Watch out, your passion is a fire that will destroy your life."
And Julia looks her in the eye and says, "I am not a fire, I am a river.
You cannot stop a river from seeking the ocean.
If you build a dam, I will become a flood and destroy it. But if you let me flow freely, I will be a beautiful, gentle force of nature until I reach my destination."
You know, the psychological insight here predates modern psychoanalysis by centuries.
It really highlights an obstacle to growth for us today.
How so?
Because Shakespeare, speaking through Julia, is outlining the dangers of emotional repression. Damming up the current creates pathology and rage, but allowing an authentic emotion to follow its natural, if sometimes meandering and winding course, results in harmony, beauty, and integration with the world around you.
We are so afraid of our own wild oceans sometimes. We just want to build dams.
Exactly. We want the boundaries of reason even when it's suffocating us.
And Julia solidifies this by applying the river metaphor directly to her own body and her own actions in the final lines.
She says, "Then let me go, and hinder not my course. I'll be as patient as a gentle stream, and make a pastime of each weary step, till the last step have brought me to my love. And there I'll rest, as after much turmoil, a blessed soul doth in Elysium."
Elysium. In classical mythology, Elysium is the paradise reserved for the heroic and the righteous after death. It's the ultimate state of blessed rest.
So Julia promises that her journey, which looks terrifying and chaotic to the outside world, will ultimately bring her to a state of divine peace.
It's gorgeous.
When you hold the raw, vulnerable beauty of that water metaphor in one hand and the dense, clinical, hilarious perfection of Speed's comedy monologue in the other, the full picture of this play comes into focus.
You realize Hazlitt was right all along.
This loose sketch is hiding absolute masterworks of writing.
Which logically brings us to the final and perhaps most complex critical maneuver in Hazlitt's commentary.
Okay, let's get into it.
Having presented the evidence, the rich comedy, and the soaring poetry, Hazlitt needs to synthesize his thoughts. So, to evaluate the true nature of Shakespeare's early genius, he invokes the judgment of another literary titan.
John Milton.
Yes, John Milton.
Hazlitt brings Milton into the conversation to make a very nuanced point. He states that if Shakespeare had only ever written the specific passages we just analyzed, the dog joke, the love symptoms, the river metaphor, he would almost have deserved Milton's praise of him.
Almost.
Hazlitt then quotes a famous couplet from Milton's poem, L'Allegro. "And sweetest Shakespeare, fancy's child, warbles his native wood notes wild."
Hazlitt also includes a fascinating footnote here, quoting a line from William Wordsworth. "The river wanders at its own sweet will."
Tying it back to the river.
By including Wordsworth, Hazlitt is deliberately anchoring Milton's quote back to Julia's stream imagery. He wants us to focus on the idea of wandering, natural, unforced beauty.
Let's break down Milton's quote for a second. He calls Shakespeare fancy's child. Fancy, in this era, meant imagination or fantasy.
Right.
So Shakespeare's the child of imagination. And Milton says, "This child warbles his native wood notes wild." The imagery is of a bird sitting in a forest, singing purely out of instinct.
And on the surface, Hazlitt appears to be validating Milton's assessment. He seems to be saying, look at the careless grace of the comedy, look at the unhindered stream of Julia's poetry. Milton is right.
Shakespeare's writing possesses a wild, natural, unstudied beauty. He's like a brilliantly talented songbird.
But then Hazlitt drops the hammer.
It is the very last sentence of his commentary, and it changes everything.
It really does.
Hazlitt writes, "But as it is, he deserves rather more praise than this."
He deserves rather more praise than this. We need to carefully unpack why Milton's praise, which sounds beautiful, is actually insufficient.
Why does Hazlitt reject it in the final moment?
Because Milton's praise, when you really look at it, is a massive backhanded compliment.
Oh, totally. Calling him fancy's child who warbles like a bird. It infantilizes him.
Yes.
It makes Shakespeare sound like an idiot savant who accidentally stumbles into brilliance without knowing what he's doing.
Consider the source of the quote. John Milton was one of the most deeply educated, rigorously trained, classically structured poets in human history.
He wrote Paradise Lost.
Exactly. An epic poem that is the absolute definition of labor and pretension. And I use pretension there in the neutral architectural sense of the word.
Right. It was built on intense study and strict rules.
So when Milton looks at Shakespeare, he views him through the lens of a highly educated academic looking at a peasant. Milton says, the sweet, uneducated boy. He sings wild notes like a bird. It sounds pretty, but there is no intellect behind it.
Drawing a comparative insight here, it's the equivalent of a modern, classically trained software engineer looking at a kid who built a revolutionary app in his garage and calling him a lucky tinkerer.
That's a perfect modern translation.
It sounds polite, but it's designed to strip the creator of their intellectual credibility. Milton's wood notes wild implies that Shakespeare's talent is purely biological, an instinctual accident rather than the result of a towering intellect.
And this is where Hazlitt draws the line in the sand. Hazlitt agrees that the work possesses careless grace. He agrees that it wanders like a river. But he vehemently denies that it is an accident.
A bird singing in the woods does not understand the psychological nuances of an Elizabethan gentleman suffering from the isolating pestilence of love.
No, it does not.
A bird singing in the woods cannot construct a rhetorical debate that perfectly flips a metaphor from destructive fire to a life-giving river to explain the dangers of emotional repression.
A bird does not write rich conceits.
Exactly.
Hazlitt is demanding that the reader and the literary establishment as a whole recognize the deliberate, rigorous intellect behind the careless sketch.
The felicity of Shakespeare's writing might appear effortless, but it's rooted in a profound, almost terrifyingly accurate observation of how human beings operate.
Milton praises the sound of the poetry. Hazlitt demands that we praise the mind that constructed it.
Shakespeare deserves more praise because he's not just warbling a pretty tune. He is articulating the fundamental truths of our existence, wrapping them in both farcical comedy and exquisite sentiment, and doing it so skillfully that the effort becomes invisible.
Synthesizing this entire journey we've been on, the scope of Hazlitt's defense is remarkable.
It really is. We started with a play that its own editors, men like the fastidious Mr. Pope, wanted to literally erase from history.
Dismissing it as a lowbrow mistake written to appease the gross taste of the public.
And we explored how Hazlitt rescued the play by demanding we look past the lack of surface polish. We analyzed the profound psychological richness hidden within a servant roasting his master with jokes about fasting and alphabet books.
We followed the wild, beautiful logic of Julia's river of passion.
And we ended by standing up to Milton himself, proving that an unpolished sketch is not the accidental warbling of a child, but the deliberate, brilliant output of a master who understands human nature better than we understand ourselves.
You know, it forces a necessary recalibration of how we judge not just art, but any human endeavor.
How so?
Because we are often conditioned to act like Alexander Pope. We scan the environment looking for the mark of reprobation. We look for the flaws, the grammatical errors, the lack of refinement, or the perceived low taste.
And because we're so obsessed with finding the rough edges, we completely blind ourselves to the rich conceits and the profound truth that might be buried just beneath the surface. If there is a core wisdom to extract from Hazlitt's defense of this play, it's the enduring value of careless grace.
Absolutely.
It's the realization that heavy labor and rigid perfection do not automatically guarantee quality. A heavily produced, auto-tuned pop song might be flawless, but it might also be dead inside. Sometimes, the most piercing human truths are found in the messy, trifling jokes about a dog, or the wandering, unhindered stream of a raw emotion.
And it serves as a permanent warning against the fastidious mindset. The world will always be full of gatekeepers who want to sanitize and control.
They will always be terrified of the messy, the popular, and the unrestrained.
But human life is inherently messy. Art that accurately reflects the human condition will naturally and necessarily contain those rough outlines.
So, getting to the practical how-to for our listeners, as you move through your own life this week, consider how you evaluate the things around you.
It's great exercise.
The next time you watch a movie that feels a little rough around the edges, or read a book that doesn't follow the traditional rules, or even when you're reviewing a colleague's early, messy draft of a project at work, pay attention to the voice in your head.
Ask yourself who you are in that moment.
Right. Are you operating like the fastidious Mr. Pope? Are you just holding a red pen, desperate to find mistakes, so you can assert your authority and place a mark of reprobation on the things that lack polish?
Or can you train yourself to be like Hazlitt?
Can you step back, tolerate the lack of pretension, look past the rough outlines of the sketch, and search for the undeniable talent, the rich conceits, and the untamed wood notes wild that are waiting to be heard?
Because the truth is, absolute perfection is an illusion that usually suffocates life.
Sometimes the waters are muddy. Sometimes the acoustic demo makes you cringe at first listen. But if you have the patience to look closer, you might find that buried right there in the carelessness is the exact brilliance you were searching for.
It's been such a fascinating deep dive.
It really has. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.